02nd of March, 2026. Late evening. Recorded by P.A. Shaz. Why do we need terms and theories? To read a text without theory is simply to be mastered by an ideology you cannot name. The central philosophical tension in literary studies lies between essence and construction. On one side is the belief that literature contains timeless truths about human nature. This view assumes that a text reflects an objective reality. It trusts that a human author creates meaning with clear intent. On the other side is the belief that reality is shaped entirely by language and history. This view denies that a text has one fixed center. It argues that meaning is highly unstable and produced solely by cultural codes. Theory lives in the quiet, persistent friction between these two poles. We must ask exactly what terms and theories are. A term is not just a descriptive label. It is a conceptual boundary. It shapes what we can see and dictates what we must ignore. Theory is the systematic explanation of our critical practice. It looks at the hidden motives behind our reading habits. It connects our acts of reading to hidden structures of power, religion, and economics. Theory became necessary because reading is never a natural act. Every reading relies on deep, unvoiced assumptions. Without theory, these assumptions remain invisible and unquestioned. Literature was once seen as an organic whole that could simply teach and delight. Theory emerged to reveal that this harmony was often a specific, motivated historical construct. Historically, modern theory emerged as a sharp reaction against liberal humanism. Liberal humanism assumes that great literature benefits all humanity equally. It treats texts as isolated, beautiful objects that speak to universal human conditions. It claims to be entirely free from political bias. Theory systematically exposed this claim as false. It showed that traditional criticism often enforces the values of ruling classes. The standard canon of great books was determined largely by the politics of power, not just artistic merit. Theory was needed to show that human identity is not fixed. It proved that our social roles are built by language, not by nature. The history of this shift involves major thinkers. Plato and Aristotle laid the early rules for Western thought. Plato saw poetry as a dangerous imitation of physical appearances. Aristotle defined it as a moral art that shapes human emotions through pity and fear. For centuries, theory meant following these classical rules. During the Enlightenment, thinkers trusted in universal and uniform human reason. They believed that reason would dissipate the darkness of superstition. Romanticism later shifted this focus. It viewed poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It placed the creative imagination of the author at the center of meaning. In the 20th century, theory shifted drastically again. Matthew Arnold argued that culture should be an expansion of human powers. He wanted culture to replace the fading certainties of religion. He used touchstones to evaluate art. Touchstones were short lines of great poetry used to judge the quality of other works. Following him, F.R. Leavis built a strict canon of English literature to combat the empty secularism of modern life. He saw criticism as a moral mission to redeem society. He believed great texts were inherently life-affirming. He rejected abstract theory in favor of close, moral reading. Later thinkers dismantled this moral certainty. Ferdinand de Saussure changed how we understand language itself. He separated the deep, abstract system of language, called lang, from individual speech, called parole. He proved that words do not reflect pre-existing things. Words only have meaning because they differ from other words. Language is a purely arbitrary system. Saussure explained this through two axes. The syntagmatic axis involves the horizontal combination of words. The paradigmatic axis involves the vertical substitution of words. Jacques Derrida took this linguistic insight further. He attacked the Western desire for a stable center, a habit he called logocentrism. He showed that meaning is never fully present in a word. It is always delayed and pushed along an endless chain of signs. He called this endless delay difference. Derrida attacked the idea of a transcendental signified. He proved that speech had been unfairly privileged over writing. For Derrida, a text always contradicts its own logic. It creates a structural impasse called aporia. Michel Foucault examined the relationship between language and institutions. He argued that discourse brings concepts and hierarchies into being. These discursive formations determine what is accepted as truth in any era. Foucault showed that power operates silently through these regimes of truth. He also changed how we view the creator of a text. He introduced the concept of the author function. The author is not a genius origin point, but a cultural construct tied to capitalist property laws. Mikhail Bakhtin looked at language as a social event. He introduced the idea of heteroglossia. This means a text is filled with many competing voices and dialects. The author does not control all these voices. A novel is a living dialogue between different social classes and histories. The core argument of modern theory is that meaning is produced, not found. The author does not own the text. Roland Barthes boldly declared the death of the author. He argued that the author is just a space where cultural codes mix. The reader is the one who makes the text active. Literature is not a transparent window to the world. It is a system of signs that we must actively decode. Marxist criticism adds that human consciousness is constituted by ideology. An ideology is the product of the position and interests of a particular class. New criticism formalized these ideas in America. They warned against the intentional fallacy. We cannot judge a poem by the author's intent. The poem belongs to the public, not the author. They also warned against the affective fallacy. We cannot judge a poem solely by its emotional effect upon the reader. Both fallacies push the reader to focus only on the words on the page. Reader response theory shifted the focus again. Thinkers like Wolfgang Iser created the idea of the implied reader. The text gives clues, but the reader builds the consistency of the meaning. Reader response critics focus on the ongoing mental operations of readers. They argue that the meanings of a text are the production of the individual reader. There is no one correct meaning. The text provides a horizon of expectations. This horizon designates the shared set of assumptions attributed to a generation of readers. This creates deep internal contradictions. If language cannot touch reality, how can theory explain reality? This is a severe conceptual risk. Theory claims to unmask power. But if all truth is relative, theory has no firm ground to stand on. Deconstruction risks becoming an endless, empty game of words. It can trap the reader in an infinite regression of meaning. Post-structuralism removes the human subject entirely. It turns the individual into an empty grammatical slot. If people are just constructs of ideology, they have no agency. They cannot fight effectively against oppression. Major criticisms target these specific flaws. Stephen Knapp and Walter Ben Michaels argued against theory entirely. They stated that general rules cannot govern the actual practice of reading. Other critics defend liberal humanism. They argue that theory ignores the joy of reading and the literary imagination. They claim it reduces beautiful art to dry political documents. Traditional scholars say theory destroys the shared values of a culture. It replaces them with an absolute, sterile relativism. We can apply these theoretical tools to an English literary multilingual example. Consider William Langland's medieval poem, Piers Plowman. The text relies heavily on the mixing of languages. Langland writes his narrative in vernacular English. The English language represents the temporal world. It is the voice of the common people. But Langland interrupts the English narrative with Latin verses from the Psalms. The Latin represents the eternal world. It is the voice of the church and absolute authority. These two languages do not just sit next to each other. They interact dialogically. The English verse questions and explores human suffering. The Latin verse provides ritual answers. The human world and the divine world are placed in a dialogue. By mixing languages, the text decenters authority. The vernacular tests the sacred. The sacred judges the vernacular. The poem becomes a site of cultural intersection. The reader must navigate the tension between the English quest and the Latin code. The text refuses a single, monologic truth. It proves that language is always shared and contested. The text acts as an intertext. Intertextuality denotes the interdependence of literary texts. It suggests that any text is a mosaic of quotations. Langland absorbs the Latin liturgy and transforms it into an English vision. The Latin verses act as touchstones. The Latin anchors the English vernacular. It creates a hermeneutic circle. The hermeneutic circle explains how we understand a text. We must approach the parts with a prior sense of the meaning of the whole. Yet we can only know the whole by knowing the parts. The English and Latin parts mutually qualify each other. We now move to a structured examination of these concepts. For clarity, we can outline 4 argumentative angles used to approach texts in advanced study. Angle 1 is formalism. This angle treats the text as an independent object. It focuses entirely on words, rhythms, and figures of speech. It ignores the author's life and historical era. It seeks the organic unity of the work. It judges the work by intrinsic criteria such as complexity and equilibrium. It relies on defamiliarization. Defamiliarization disrupts ordinary language to make the familiar world strange. It uses irony, paradox, and ambiguity to build meaning. Angle 2 is historicism. This angle embeds the text in its time. It views the text as a cultural construct. It uncovers how a work confirms or subverts the political power of its day. It treats literature and history as interacting networks of social practices. It denies that literature occupies a transhistorical aesthetic realm. It relies on the subversion-containment dialectic. This concept argues that power allows subversion only to contain it better. It uses thick descriptions to recover the meanings a social event had for its participants. Angle 3 is psychoanalysis. This angle reads the text as an expression of the unconscious. It looks for repressed desires and childhood traumas. It treats the words on the page as a disguise for hidden fears. It examines symptomatic places in the text, such as ambiguities and evasions. It uses the hermeneutics of suspicion. This means approaching a text as a veiled set of representations. It examines the Lacanian mirror stage, where a subject enters the symbolic order of language. In this order, the phallus is the privileged signifier. Freud's Oedipus complex is often mapped onto the narrative structure. Angle 4 is feminism. This angle critiques patriarchal ideology. It exposes how texts subordinate women. It examines how women are taught to internalize patriarchal ideology. It seeks to recover lost female voices and alternative traditions. It challenges traditional male notions of literary value. It explores the concept of écriture féminine, a writing that subverts male-centered language. It highlights the differences between sex as anatomy and gender as a social construction. It gave rise to gynocriticism, which focuses entirely on women as writers. It resists phallogocentric language. These angles face distinct possible criticisms. Formalism is often blind to history and politics. Historicism can reduce art to mere social documents. Psychoanalysis forces complex characters into narrow clinical boxes. Feminism can rely too heavily on modern political agendas. All theoretical angles risk erasing the primary joy of reading. One useful comparative framework for examinations is the opposition of mimesis and semiosis. Mimesis views the text as a mirror held up to nature. It evaluates how accurately a book reflects real life. Mimesis is representation. Semiosis views the text as a system of signs. It evaluates how conventions and codes produce the illusion of reality. Semiosis is the life of signs within society. A profound philosophical limitation remains within the theory of constructivism. If every identity is a social construction, how do we define justice? If the self is merely an effect of language, who is suffering? We use theory to dismantle oppressive systems. Yet, we must use the language of those systems to do so. Postcolonial studies faces this same tension. It rejects the master narrative of Western imperialism. It examines the hybridization of colonial languages. Yet, it relies heavily on Western theoretical frameworks to mount this critique. We attack the idea of absolute truth. But the claim that there is no truth acts as its own absolute truth. This paradox haunts all modern criticism. Harold Bloom argued for the anxiety of influence. He claimed every reader misreads a text to make it their own. If all reading is misreading, what is the value of theory? We are trapped in the prison of language. Can we ever encounter a text purely on its own terms, or is every act of reading fatally haunted by the theories we bring to the page?